small-town Maine, police pursue the killer of a young mother for 20 years, waiting for technology to match their perseverance. A student disappears on his way to class.
Bye.
A ransom is demanded. Is it a kidnapping, con game, or something far more sinister? Detectives in Washington State must find a way to outsmart a killer who knows their every move before he slips through their fingers. Murders of passion can often lead investigators straight to a killer. But when the clues are few and the leads tenuous, detectives know they are searching for something emotionless. A killer who is cold-blooded. Norridgewock, Maine, November 23, 1976. Police discover a car in the bushes near River Road. The engine still running. There was no one in sight. The officer called in the license plate number. The dispatcher said the car had been reported missing by the owner, Vaughn Stevens. Stevens claimed that his girlfriend had borrowed the car earlier in the evening to do some shopping, but had not returned. Inside the vehicle, the officer discovered blood on the passenger seat. Vaughn Stevens was contacted and asked to respond to the scene. The officer continued to examine the vehicle. Inside the trunk, partially covered by a jacket, he discovered the body of a woman. She was wearing only a pair of socks. Homicide investigations in rural areas fall to the state police. After being notified, investigators began to scour the area for clues. When Vaughn Stevens arrived with a friend, he positively identified his car. His friend had to identify the victim in the trunk. She was Stevens' girlfriend, 30-year-old Janet Baxter. Distraught, Stevens was allowed to leave the scene. Maine State Police Detective Chick Love continued his investigation.
In the car, we found the groceries that she had purchased at the store that night. We found the sales slip, the cash register tape that told us what store she was in and exactly what time that she was there.
The coroner's autopsy revealed Janet Baxter had been shot in the head and chest with bullets from a .22 caliber handgun. She had also been raped. Biological evidence from her body was preserved for testing on glass slides known as slide mailers. The bullets and slide mailers were sent to the crime lab for further analysis. The car Janet had been driving also underwent a thorough investigation. Forensics experts dusted the exterior and discovered a set of latent fingerprints. In the trunk, a single hair was retrieved. Later examination showed it did not belong to Baxter. Hoping to find witnesses, detectives began canvassing the area near River Road. One resident, Clarice Merrill, said she had seen something odd the night before. While driving home, Merrill saw two vehicles pull off the road at the same location where Janet Baxter's body was later found. One of the cars was a yellow Volkswagen. Merrill believed the other car was a Ford LTD. Inside, she saw a man and a woman.
It was dark. I didn't even...
The woman
I just
appeared
thought,
to be asleep.
anything else? I'll make sure that I...
Merrill helped create a composite drawing of the man in the LTD, while police began making efforts to locate the yellow bug.
Thank you.
Cough medicine.
In most murder cases, spouses and significant others are always considered suspects. The victim's boyfriend, Vaughn Stevens, was questioned in depth the next day. He agreed to take a polygraph test. He told police that Janet Baxter worked as a nurse and had recently been through a bitter divorce.
No, sweetie, you need to go back to bed.
She had custody of her daughter, Julie.
Code. Let me help you with that. You got that?
Around 9:30, Janet decided to go to the store. Stevens' car was blocking the driveway. He gave her his keys.
All right.
All right.
Janet said she would be back in a few
drive safe.
minutes.
Around midnight, she didn't show up.
When she
That's when I
failed to
called the police.
return, he phoned police.
Yes, sir.
The polygraph test indicated Stevens was telling the truth.
Hey, gentlemen. Good evening.
Detectives also
Detective
questioned
Chicklove.
Baxter's ex-husband,
We're investigating a homicide that happened on November 23rd.
but he had a solid alibi, and like Stevens, he was dismissed as a
Thursday,
suspect.
right? I was working that evening.
Investigators continued searching the area for a yellow Volkswagen.
Can I help you?
Good evening. I'm Detective Chicklove. I'd like to ask you a few
A
questions.
local resident, Galen Lessard, owned a similar car.
I'm not involved in this.
When questioned, he was uncooperative and refused to be interviewed.
No, you got the wrong person. You need to see someone else. Okay, bye.
Investigators probed Lessard's background. Though nothing in his records indicated he was capable of murder, investigators learned he was friends with other men in town. Their records told a different story. One was a suspect in the murder of a college co-ed 5 years earlier. Another slightly resembled the composite drawing Merrill had helped police assemble. But none of these men would talk to authorities. The investigation threatened to turn cold. On November 28th, almost a week since the murder, an officer noticed a white sedan parked at exactly the same spot where Janet Baxter's body was found. A man was standing outside the car. He appeared to be looking for something. The officer noted the registration and passed it along. Investigators ran a check on the plates and learned the car belonged to a man named Albert Cochran. A background check revealed that Cochran had done prison time in Illinois after pleading guilty to murdering his wife in 1964.
Any different
Despite a sentence of 50 to 75 years, he was paroled after 12 years. In early 1976, his parole was transferred to the same town in Maine where Janet Baxter lived. Cochran was brought in for questioning.
You observed that crime scene last night?
He claimed that on the night of the murder, he was smoking marijuana and drinking with 3 strangers in the parking lot of a local bar.
There that day?
Yeah, on my way back.
They invited him to a party, but he didn't want to leave his car near the bar, so he moved it to a supermarket parking lot,
Gave me a ride,
the same
back to
one
the
Janet
grocery
Baxter
store.
had visited
Saw
the night she was murdered.
police over there. I was just curious. So went over there, just
Cochran
take a
said
look
he
around.
got in the stranger's car, but made them pull over and let him out when he became suspicious of them.
'Cause, I mean, not...
He claimed he then walked several miles to his brother's home in Norridgewock. On the way, he stated he saw police gathered at an area off of River Road.
Of your hair, if you don't mind looking that over.
Though he refused to take a polygraph, investigators obtained fingerprints and samples of his hair for comparison with previously gathered evidence.
Just relax.
Cochran's fingerprints were examined and compared to those lifted from the exterior of the car in which Baxter was found. His hair sample was compared against the hair found in the car's trunk. Neither the prints nor the hair samples produced a match. There was no hard evidence pointing to Cochran as the murderer. The investigation hit an impasse. For the next 20 years, the case was passed down through dozens of detectives, each one running into the brick wall presented by the lack of hard evidence. It seemed Janet Baxter's death would never be solved. But her family refused to let it go. "20 years had passed since the murder of 30-year-old Janet Baxter in the small New England town of Norridgewock, Maine. During those years, no arrests had been made. Robert McCleary, Janet Baxter's father, was determined to keep the case alive, no matter how long it took to solve. Every year on the anniversary of his daughter's death, he would call police headquarters.
My desire to continue my contact with the state police was deeply motivated by my desire to see that somebody paid for what they had done to Jan, that somebody was not going to get away with murder, and that to continue to seek the information, to continue the investigation, and to give us some sense of closure.
In 1996, the case was handed over to Maine State Police Detective Mike Mitchell. After reviewing the case files, Mitchell paid a visit to Janet Baxter's parents.
Detective Mike Mitchell,
How do you do?
State Police. He's here to
The
say
detective
some
had
things
grown
to us.
up near Norridgewock and had been in elementary school when the murder occurred.
Well, Mr. McClary, Mrs. McClary, I'm a detective with the Maine State Police, and I just want
He promised he would do everything in his power to solve this case.
If you have any questions of me, don't hesitate to call.
Mitchell began by retracing the steps of the previous investigations. He was struck by the loose ends presented by the owner of the yellow Volkswagen, Galen Lessard, and his cronies, who refused to talk to police. Despite those unresolved issues, he decided to take another crack at Albert Cochran.
Some detectives felt that Albert Patrick Cochran was a suspect and was the person responsible for the murder of Janet Baxter. Some detectives felt that it was another group of people that socialized together. So what I did is I took down all the names of all possible suspects that hadn't been alibied, not to have been in the area at the time, and listed them all down on a piece of paper, and by priority as to who looked like a better suspect than the others. And Albert Patrick Cochran was on the top of the list.
To make his case, Mitchell first had to inventory what evidence had survived over the years. He contacted Maine State Police forensic chemist Chris Montagna.
My other two roles were to see what was still around as far as evidence that had survived 20 years, and second, to reconstruct the notes and the work that had been done 20 years earlier and try and piece all of that together and link it to a suspect that Detective Mitchell was working on as the murderer of Janet Baxter.
Now let's see what we've got. We've got the Volvo,
Searching through the boxes of evidence, investigators found the original slide mailers. One looked blank, but was thought to possibly contain swabs of biological evidence from the victim's body. If the evidence had remained intact, it might be possible to extract DNA, a technique not in existence 20 years before. Under the microscope, the slide surprised everyone, revealing the presence of biological evidence removed from Janet Baxter.
So both of them have last name. This one.
Oh wow, I see him.
Now the number of.
Now, investigators needed to find a DNA sample from Cochran. They did not have to go far to find what they needed. The sample of Cochran's hair collected in 1976 was also preserved in the file. But would the hair have viable material for DNA testing? Forensic DNA specialist David Munich was given the assignment.
These head hair samples were known head hair samples. When they're collected, they're actually plucked from the head, and they have skin attached to the hair root, as opposed to hairs that are cut or hairs that just naturally fall out of your head.
Both samples provided ample material to perform the DNA tests. When the tests were concluded and the comparisons made, the results were overwhelming. The DNA tests showed there was only one chance in 37 billion that Janet Baxter's killer was somebody other than Albert Cochran. Munich called Detective Mitchell with the news.
When it came back a perfect match, I can remember I was driving down the road, I picked up my car phone, and I just couldn't believe it. My eyes filled up with water thinking that it was, you know, something you'll never forget.
Any idea of the date of birth?
It's going to be in March, I'm going to think March 17th, 1938 maybe. He's about 62 years old. Is this something?
But where was Albert Cochran?
What's the last name?
Cochran. C-O-C-H-R-A-N.
Computer checks tracked him down to an address in Stuart, Florida. On the morning of March 17, 1998, Detective Mitchell and Florida police arrested Cochran at his home. He was extradited to Maine to stand trial for the murder of Janet Baxter. Based on the evidence gathered over 21 years earlier, detectives believe Cochran had seen Janet Baxter alone in a deserted grocery store parking lot. His prior history of violence reasserting itself, Cochran seized the opportunity to abduct his victim, later raping and killing her. On May 20th, 1999, it took a jury only 2.5 hours to find Albert Cochran guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, this time without the possibility of parole. Murder is not the only cold-blooded crime. In South Dakota, a mother's only son is held for ransom. Aberdeen, South Dakota, May 8, 1985. 20-year-old Michael Kinney left the home he shared with his mother, Sandra McNeil, to attend classes at Northern State College.
Yeah, I've been working hard on it.
All right, I'll be back.
Okay.
Bye.
When Michael didn't return by the following morning, his mother became concerned. She decided to look for her son. Near the house, she found Michael's car parked on the side of the road. Michael was nowhere in sight. Sandra McNeil contacted the sheriff's office. Brown County Sheriff Mark Milbrandt was assigned to look into the disappearance.
We had some concerns due to the fact that Michael Kenny's car was found across the roadway from his residence and had been parked there for, we're assuming, anywhere from 24 to probably 35 hours, 36.
The following day, Sandra McNeil received a mysterious phone call from an unidentified man. The caller told her to go to a bar in Aberdeen later that evening and look for an envelope under the payphone if she wanted to find out what happened to her son. She was told not to contact the police. Kinney's mother went to the bar and found an envelope hidden beneath the payphone. Inside was a ransom note demanding $200,000 in exchange for her son. Despite the kidnapper's warning, Sandra McNeil gave the note to sheriff's investigators, who examined it for clues. South Dakota Department of Criminal Investigations agent Doug Lake was brought in to assist with the investigation. His first priority was to deal with the difficulties of obtaining the money.
The ransom money was the victim's mother's money, and it was on Friday after the bank is closed, and the agents, the investigators, went around to the different banks in town and gathered up all the cash that they had on hand.
Three days after her son disappeared, Kinney's mother received a second phone call.
Hello?
This time, investigators were listening.
Is my son okay?
Sandra McNeil was instructed to leave the money in Aberdeen Park at 9 p.m. Investigators traced the call to a public phone box, but the kidnapper hung up and disappeared before the police could close in. The phone had been wiped clean of prints.
Okay, Melgar Park. Just a minute, Is Mike all right? He's fine. Can I talk to him? Until I get to Mike.
Investigators studied the tape. The caller stated Michael was not hurt, but refused to allow him to talk to his mother until the ransom was paid. The kidnapper described Michael's clothing to authenticate his threat. Investigators felt they had no choice but to follow the kidnapper's demands. The money for the ransom was bundled and placed into a briefcase. Investigators also placed a hidden tracking device inside. An undercover female police officer made the ransom drop as scheduled. A short while later, the briefcase was retrieved by a man who then ran off with more than he bargained for. Police quickly followed. The suspect drove to a residence where he parked the blue Oldsmobile he was driving, transferred the briefcase containing the ransom money to an orange Camaro, and was joined by an unidentified female from inside the residence. Led by the tracking device, agents followed the suspects across the Minnesota border. Just inside Minnesota, a roadblock halted the suspect's flight. They were ordered out of their car and arrested. The driver was identified as 19-year-old Todd Miller. The passenger was his 17-year-old sister. Agents retrieved the briefcase from the Camaro's trunk.
We got something here.
The car was closely examined for clues, but there was no sign of Michael Kinney or any other leads to his whereabouts.
The money.
I'm telling you the truth.
Investigators questioned the suspect separately. After a thorough interrogation, investigators found that Miller's sister genuinely appeared to have no clue about Kinney's disappearance or the ransom money. She was released. Todd Miller told police a drug dealer named Bob Jacobs had asked him to pick up a package and deliver it to him in Minnesota.
outside.
Miller claimed that in return, Jacobs had promised to help him financially. When asked if he knew Kinney, Miller said he was a good friend, but he had no idea Jacobs' job was in any way related to Kinney's disappearance. Miller's story provided investigators with an opportunity. They would use him in a sting operation to nab the drug dealer. The ransom money was returned to him, and he was transported to the pre-arranged delivery point. Jacobs never appeared. Detectives brought Miller back to the police station. The following day, Miller admitted that Jacobs' story was a lie. The kidnapping had been a hoax. Claiming it was all Michael Kinney's idea, Miller explained he had helped stage the entire plot. Miller said he had been friends with Kinney since high school. Alleging Kinney dabbled in various drugs and wanted to move to Canada, Miller stated he was recruited into the kidnapping scam as a way to help Kinney finance his planned relocation. Detectives put Miller through an extensive polygraph test.
Did you harm Michael?
The results of the test were inconclusive, but tended to show the overall truthfulness of his statements. That meant Michael Kinney was alive and on the run. A warrant was issued for his arrest.
Do you live at 123
Police in South Dakota continued their search for 20-year-old Michael Kinney. What had initially appeared to be a kidnapping was now starting to look like a deception.
Have anything to do with the disappearance?
Kinney's friend, Todd Miller, claimed to be a reluctant participant in helping Michael Kinney stage his own disappearance and extort his mother.
As well as a swell rib.
As the result of Miller's story, a warrant was issued for Kinney's arrest,
This is where it is.
but his whereabouts remained a mystery. Detectives questioned Kinney's girlfriend. She told them she was with Michael the night before he was reported missing. He had dropped her off at her house after they had been out for a pizza and soda. She had not seen or heard from him since. Weeks later, an Aberdeen farmer made a startling discovery. After noticing a foul odor coming from an unused ice house on his property, he entered the building. There, he found a body. Police were immediately called to the scene. Though the body was badly decomposed, investigators found evidence of 3 bullet wounds and what appeared to be blunt trauma injuries to the victim's head. The farmer had no idea who the victim was or how the body ended up in the ice house. Through dental matches, police would soon learn the victim's identity. They had found Michael Kinney.
It was a big impact on us. You know, all of a sudden we went from a possible theft by deception warrant to a kidnapping murder, a homicide.
At the autopsy, the cause of death was determined to be a bullet wound to the aorta. Fibers, perhaps from a rug, were collected from the victim's clothing. It was estimated he had been dead for 2 to 3 weeks, possibly from the time of his disappearance. With Michael Kinney dead, the investigation shifted back to Todd Miller. For investigators, it was clear that he was the killer. But now they had to prove it. To determine if he had written the ransom note, he was returned to the police station to provide handwriting samples. While waiting for those results, warrants to search Miller's cars were obtained. Investigators discovered that the blue Oldsmobile Miller used to pick up the ransom money had been recently washed. However, detectives managed to find 2 hairs that had survived the cleaning. Fiber samples from the trunk were also collected. Next, the interior of the trunk was treated with luminol. This process revealed evidence of blood, but the samples were too deteriorated for analysis. The evidence was hand-delivered to State Crime Lab analyst Rex Reese for comparison. Reese compared fibers removed from Kinney's clothing to those removed from the trunk of Miller's vehicle.
There was an association of the fibers that comprise the liner in the trunk and present as loose fibers on the metal part or the base bottom of the trunk itself. These were black rayon synthetic textile fibers that comprise this liner. Present on Mr. Kinney's clothing were a number of these same type of black fibers.
Though the analysis was incriminating, it was only circumstantial. Investigators needed hard evidence that Michael Kinney had been in the trunk of Miller's car. Reese next compared the 2 hairs recovered from the Oldsmobile's trunk with those taken from Kinney's head during autopsy. But Reese could only make a general comparison. The hairs recovered from the trunk were too damaged for a conclusive analysis.
The hairs had been severed at the proximal end or near the scalp by blunt force, so we couldn't see any of the root structures there. But they exhibited human hair characteristics that were most similar to that of Mr. Kinney.
Reese's analysis brought investigators one step closer to making their case. But it still wasn't enough. Experts conducted an extensive examination of Miller's handwriting. The unique characteristics identified in the ransom note matched those from Miller's sample.
Mr. Miller?
Yes?
Despite his protests, Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Detectives determined that Miller had wanted to help his father get out of financial problems. He turned to the person he called his friend. On the night of May 8, 1985, Michael Kinney dropped off his girlfriend and headed back home. Police theorized that he was flagged down by his friend.
How's it going, Mike? Hey, Todd.
Completely unaware of what was about to befall him,
Hey, Mike.
Kinney was an easy mark for the cold-blooded violence Miller had planned.
What's up with the gun, man?
After striking Kinney's head, Miller loaded him into the trunk of his car and quickly fled the scene. Miller drove to an isolated farm, where he then shot and killed the still unconscious Kinney. To cover his tracks, Miller hid the body in a derelict ice house. He then returned home and coldly set in motion his plans to extort Kinney's mother. At his trial, Todd Miller was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, possession of ransom money, and forgery. He received 2 life terms plus 20 years. In a community near Preston, Washington, another missing persons case was to turn deadly. On September 4th, 1996, Rex and Shirley Wren reported their son, 35-year-old James Brad Wren, missing. They told police that their son's roommate, Emmett Marcel, was known to be violent. The parents told police that 2 months before, Marcel became enraged at their son while the two were working on the house they shared together. Wren left the residence so Marcel could cool off. When Wren returned later that night, Marcel shot him in the leg.
Oh my God!
Their son had refused to press charges. The information was enough for police to open a missing persons investigation. A background check revealed that police had been dispatched to Marcel and Wren's residence several times before to settle angry disputes between the two men. On August 10th, a month after the shooting, Wren called 911 to file a formal complaint against Marcel for another incident. He had not been seen since. Assigned to the Major Crimes Unit of the King County Sheriff's Office, Detective Denny Gula headed the investigation to locate the missing man.
The last time he was seen was with a King County police officer. There was a disturbance at his house, and Sergeant Bachmeyer, the patrol supervisor at that time, had contacted him at home and transported him to the Fall City substation.
Gula began by reviewing the responding officer's log of the August 10th incident. Records showed that Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer had taken Wren to a nearby police station, taken a statement, then released him. Hoping for more detailed information, Detective Gula put in phone calls to Sergeant Bachmeyer. While waiting for a response, he continued his investigation. He questioned Wren's neighbors. One, Richard Pettygrove, recalled that the last time he saw Wren was on August 10th. He reported seeing Wren driven away in a police car following a fight between Wren and his roommate, Emmett Marcel.
A real angry
Richard
person.
described Emmett Marcel as a dangerous and angry person.
Yeah.
All of the neighbors felt certain Marcel had something to do with Wren's disappearance.
My business cards.
Detective Gula ran Marcel's name through the law enforcement database. Marcel had recently been put in a Tacoma jail for an unrelated traffic violation. For investigators, it was time to pay a visit to the prime suspect in James Wren's disappearance.
CCU. Okay, thank you.
Police in King County, Washington searched for 35-year-old James Brad Wren, reported missing by his parents. Wren's roommate, Emmett Marcel, was quickly becoming the prime suspect. Police went to question him in a Tacoma jail, where he sat for unrelated traffic violations.
Is your name Emmett Marcel?
Yes.
Marcel agreed to take a polygraph. He appeared unconcerned and claimed to have no idea about where Wren might be.
Did you or did you not?
On the evening of August 10th, the day Wren was last seen, Emmett claimed he was with a friend in nearby Tukwila, Washington.
You do not know why you...
Though the polygraph strongly indicated he was telling the truth, investigators were unconvinced. They obtained warrants to search Marcel's car. On the floorboard, investigators found a prescription bottle with Wren's name on it. They also found a hammer with a reddish-brown substance on it. In the lab, samples of the reddish-brown flecks on the hammer were tested, but no conclusive results could be reached. The samples were too deteriorated. The case against Marcel seemed to be going nowhere. A search warrant was obtained for Marcel and Wren's residence.
See anything else out of the unusual?
Inside, a suspicious stain on the carpet drew the investigators' attention. Samples of the stain were preserved on swabs. Detectives hoped this was the break they needed.
We're thinking that this is a pretty substantial piece of evidence. We sent it off to the crime lab for processing. And what we find out is that it's bovine or cow's blood.
With no physical evidence tying Marcel to Wren's disappearance, he was eliminated as a suspect. They hoped that Officer Bachmeyer, who had taken Wren's statement on August 10th, could shed some light on the disappearance. After several weeks, Bachmeyer finally contacted detectives and came in for questioning. He apologized for the delay, saying he was under a lot of pressure, which was recently compounded when his home had been burglarized and set on fire. In fact, he explained that when he responded to the 911 on August 10th, he recognized Wren. Bachmeier was certain Wren was the person he had seen fleeing from his house after it had caught fire. When Wren was brought in to file his complaint, Bachmeier confronted him about the arson. Wren admitted to the crimes. But after writing out his confession, Wren stormed out of the station. For Detective Gula, Bachmeier's story seemed odd.
You know, people just don't storm off and walk out of the police station, especially when this person has just admitted to you to have burned your house down.
Okay, now let's try to...
Though it was unclear if Bachmeier was involved in Wren's disappearance, investigators decided to take a closer look into the arson and burglary at his home. Detective Gula met with the Renton PD arson investigators who had been the first to look into the fire at Bachmeier's house. After first believing the motive behind the fire was possibly an act of revenge by a criminal, they were now convinced Bachmeier had set the fire himself. The arsonist had used flares stuck in plastic containers to start the blaze, a method that would give the perpetrator plenty of time to leave the scene before the fire actually caught. The investigation further revealed numerous valuable items, including jewelry, limited edition prints, CDs, and leather jackets, had been removed from the house prior to the fire and stored in the garage to avoid being damaged. King County Sheriff's Detective Sue Peters also worked the investigation.
Basically, Renton police detectives were concerned and thought Bachmeier possibly could be a suspect because one of the neighbor ladies had actually seen what she believed was Sergeant Bachmeier leaving on his motorcycle in the middle of the night, and then several minutes later, his house is on fire.
Due to all of the conflicting circumstances, Bachmeier's insurance company had refused to pay his claim unless he took a polygraph, something he refused to do. He was stripped of his badge and gun and was suspended from the department. He was now the prime suspect in Wren's disappearance. But police had no motive and no body to suggest a crime had taken place. Investigators would have to outsmart a man who knew how to hide evidence. Police in Washington State were beginning to suspect that fellow officer Sergeant Matt Bachmeier was responsible for the disappearance of 35-year-old James Brad Wren. According to Bachmeier, Wren had confessed to torching and burglarizing the officer's home just before he disappeared. A copy of Wren's confession to Sergeant Bachmeier was obtained. Each page bore Wren's signature. The statement and the signatures, however, appeared to be written in a different hand. But it was not unusual for an investigator to write out a story and have a suspect sign it. To be sure, the confession was sent to a handwriting expert. Examiners determined that the signature at the bottom of each page was in Wren's handwriting, while the statement itself was in Bachmeier's. But the analysis revealed something more interesting. Though the entire statement was written in the same color ink, one type of pen had been used to write the first two pages, which pertained to Wren's complaint about Emmett Marcel, but pages 3, 4, and 5 had been written with a different pen. Those pages contained Wren's confession to the arson and burglary. For investigators, a clearer picture was beginning to emerge.
It was my belief that Brad Wren was going to be used as the suspect of the arson, which he was according to Sergeant Bachmeyer. And, you know, the case is really all tied together, that Sergeant Bachmeyer was becoming the focus of the arson of his own home, and so he needed to find someone that he could say set his house on fire to clear him. So he picked Brad Wren, who led a very simple life.
Search warrants were obtained for the patrol car Sergeant Bachmeyer used on the evening of August 10th. Small reddish-brown stains were found on the back seat and armrest of the patrol car. The rear seat covering was removed. Investigators were shocked to discover a much bigger stain in the foam padding. It appeared a large amount of substance had seeped through the upholstery and into the cushion. Samples of each stain were taken to the crime lab. They all tested positive for human blood. When confronted about the evidence, Bachmeyer stated Wren had experienced a nosebleed while in the patrol car.
You being the one.
Police didn't buy it. Examiners developed experiments to determine how much blood it would take to leave such a large stain under the patrol car's rear seat. By using different amounts of human blood to soak back seats from similar patrol cars, criminalists ascertained the absorption rate of the foam padding and the amount of blood needed to make a similar size stain. They determined that a minimum of 200 milliliters, or nearly a cup of blood, was involved. Far more than even the worst nosebleed would produce. Examiners had to prove that the blood in the patrol car came from Wren. But without a body, there were no samples to compare. It fell to forensic chemist Kim Duddy to find a way around that problem.
Both his biological parents were still alive and were willing to give blood samples. So our DNA unit took the blood samples from both his biological mother and father and tested it to the question stain on the seat from Bachmeyer's vehicle.
The DNA analysis showed that the blood from Bachmeyer's patrol car had come from the biological child of Rex and Shirley Wren. Even without a body, the evidence was now overwhelming that Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer was responsible for the murder of James Wren. The veteran police officer was arrested. If any doubt remained, it was cleared up on February 2nd, 1997, less than 3 months after Bachmeyer's arrest. Bone and clothing fragments were found near a secluded cul-de-sac in Cougar Mountain Park. Among the most identifiable pieces were a skull and a red, white, and blue cast. Keys to the gated park were found on Bachmeyer's keychain. Police believe that Sergeant Bachmeyer's scheme to make some easy cash by setting up a phony arson of his home backfired when his insurance company became suspicious. He needed to prove to them that criminal forces were out to get him. Wren became a patsy in his twisted plan. Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Killers who strike without remorse, whose motives are obscure, can frustrate detectives in their efforts to solve a case. But dogged investigation, coupled with patience and the ever-advancing scientific methods of the crime lab, can often produce results, no matter how cold-blooded the crime. A quiet town is racked with terror as police hunt a killer who preys on young women. A vague description and inadequate clues are all they have. The next move is up to him. Someone took great pains to try to dispose of a body. Stripped of her identity, This victim can't lead detectives to her killer. Any chance of justice must be found in the dead woman's hands. A dark night, a sharp curve, and a woman lies dead at the bottom of a canyon. It looks like an accident, but maybe that was the plan. Most people don't kill unless they're certain they can get away with it. Murderers always believe they can outwit the police. And that's their fatal error. In the late night hours on Tuesday, November 23, 1982, police in Morris County, New Jersey were visited by the mother and co-worker of 18-year-old Amy Hoffman. Amy had failed to return from her job at a nearby mall. Amy's mother told police that her daughter worked at the dress store 2 nights a week. She was on her high school cheerleading team and was saving to go to college to become a chiropractor. Amy's co-worker said that Amy helped her lock up. It was around 9:30, and they were among the last at the mall. When Amy failed to return home, her mother went to the mall to look for her. Her car was the only one in the lot. Her keys were in the ignition. Amy's book bag, purse, and wallet were all on the seat. But there was no sign of her daughter. Frantic, Mrs. Hoffman called Amy's co-worker. The two didn't know where else to turn. Police responded to the mall parking lot with a canine handler to track Amy. Her scent trail went cold 2 parking spaces away. Evidently, she left the mall with someone else. But who? The parking lot yielded no clues. According to Morris County Detective Sergeant John Kennecom, neither did Amy's car.
We searched the vehicle as we do routinely for fingerprints, any type of items which may assist us in the missing person, but we ultimately didn't find anything.
But that was about to change. 2 days later, on Thanksgiving Day, a man out for an afternoon walk in a secluded area of Morris County, New Jersey, made a startling discovery. The lifeless body of a young woman. He fled the scene and called police. Responding deputies from the Morris County Sheriff's Department found the victim lying in an abandoned water retention tank. From the description, police knew they had found Amy Hoffman. She had suffered multiple stab wounds. The body was removed and sent off for further analysis. Investigators began scouring the area for clues, looking for anything that might help them identify Amy's killer. Bloodstains were recovered near the tank, but later tests showed they belonged to the victim. Evidence technicians gathered all that they could. Sometimes the most valuable clues masquerade as ordinary litter. The autopsy had a little more information to offer. The victim had been stabbed repeatedly and had most likely bled to death. There were indications that she'd also been sexually assaulted, but no biological evidence was found. Fibers and bits of foam padding clinging to her boots and clothing were the only potential evidence collected. Hoping for more information, police returned to the mall to question other employees.
I need to ask you some questions.
One woman stated that when she left the mall around 9 p.m., she saw a creepy-looking man just sitting there in his car. She thought the vehicle was an old Chevy. She only caught a glimpse of the man's face. She could not offer police a detailed description. Investigators knew they would have to work quickly.
We knew we had a major offender in our community. We knew we had somebody that was a predator. And what motivated me, as well as all the other law enforcement officers who worked in this case, is we had to capture this guy before he killed again.
But 2 weeks after Amy Hoffman was murdered, a truck driver parked at a rest stop 20 minutes from the Morris County Mall was jolted from his sleep. A terrified young woman was begging for help. She was bleeding badly and barely clinging to life. The truck driver called police. Though she'd lost a lot of blood, 25-year-old Deirdre O'Brien was still conscious when the paramedics came. She told authorities that less than 1 mile from her home, a car forced her off the road. Fearing the driver of the other vehicle had been hurt in the accident, she went to see if he was okay. He brandished a knife and forced her into his car, an old Chevy. He drove her to the rest stop, sexually assaulted her, and then stabbed her repeatedly. Deirdre O'Brien would not survive her injuries. She died at the hospital, but not before giving a description of her killer.
The victim of the second homicide advised law enforcement officers that the assailant was in fact a white male. He was about the same size as the victim, that he had blue jeans on and a certain type of shirt. It was a Western type shirt.
The suspect and his vehicle matched the description of the suspect in the Amy Hoffman case. With only tiny synthetic fibers recovered from Deirdre O'Brien's clothing, investigators went to the site where she had been abducted to search for more clues. They found a tire track left in the dirt. It was photographed, and then a cast was carefully made. To preserve the impression, forensic investigators use a durable casting medium called dental stone, originally formulated for making dental casts. It sets up quickly and is more durable than traditional plaster. While the tread was only one potential clue, it was the strongest.
Most energy was put onto the tire track itself, because we could see where its location, approximately 4 feet from the victim's vehicle, that it was probably the suspect's tire.
The cast and photographs of the tread were sent to forensic tire expert Pete McDonald.
And I looked at the tread design guide book and found that there were maybe 20 different imprints similar. However, the Cyberling Snow Power tire looked the most consistent.
Detective Sergeant Kennecom carried the photo of the tread impression to shopping malls, neighborhoods, and junkyards. But he couldn't find a single tire like the one Pete McDonald described. Investigators were driven to find the killer before the killer found victim number 3.
Where it occurred?
But then a call came in. There'd been another stabbing. Investigators in Morris County, New Jersey struggled to solve the homicides of 2 young women. All of the clues pointed to a serial killer, but none pointed to a suspect. As investigators raced to identify a suspect before he could strike again, another stabbing was reported. This time, the victim was a man, but the details were familiar. 34-year-old James Kodatich told police that while he was driving, he was pulled over by an early model Chevy with a flashing blue light on the dash. The driver of the other car pulled him out of his vehicle and stabbed him. Kodatich fought off his attacker and fled to his mother's house. His description of the assailant resembled the murderer at large. To police, James Kodatich was fortunate. His wounds were not serious. An ambulance came to take him to the hospital. Before leaving, he gave the police permission to examine his car for any trace evidence his attacker might have left. Hoping to find evidence linking this incident to the unsolved murders, examiners thoroughly vacuumed the car. It was an early model Chevy, the same type as described by witnesses of the previous 2 murders. Thinking it may just be a strange coincidence, Detective Kennecom took a closer look at the tires.
I looked at the right rear tire of the vehicle, and it was in fact like the tire we were looking for. I then went to my attaché case where I carried a copy of the sketch of the tire with certain important measurements, measured the tire on the right rear of the vehicle, saw some oddities with that particular tire, and made a match.
James Kodatich's vehicle was now linked to the abduction site of 25-year-old Deirdre O'Brien, murdered a few weeks before. The killer's 3rd victim became the investigation's prime suspect. To be absolutely certain that the tires matched, investigators turned again to forensic tire expert Pete McDonald. The tire in question is rolled on what's essentially a giant ink pad, leaving an impression of its entire tread circumference on a length of white cardboard. After completing this process on Kodatich's Chevy, investigators sent a negative transparency of the tire impression found at Deirdre O'Brien's abduction site to Peter McDonald. McDonald then compared that to the suspect's tire impression. After 25 hours of scrutiny, McDonald was absolutely certain he'd found what he was looking for.
I was able to make a positive identification because there were many cuts and tears in the tire that were unique to that tire only.
That proved that Kodatich's car was at the scene. The information was enough for investigators to obtain a warrant. Kodatich was still in the hospital when arrested for suspicion of murdering Deirdre O'Brien. When confronted with the tire impression evidence, the suspect admitted making a sharp turn on that stretch of highway, but not at the time of the murder. Though police did not believe him, the evidence was only circumstantial. Investigators had to find another way to build their case. And not just for the murder of Deirdre O'Brien, but also for the murder of 18-year-old Amy Hoffman. They wouldn't need to go very far. The fibers collected from Kodatich's car interior were compared against those found on both victims.
Victims' evidence, such as fibers from skirts, were actually found in his car, and then carpet fibers from his vehicle and foam from the seat cushion was actually found on the victims. So there was a cross-link.
Despite the evidence against him, Kodatich maintained he was not the killer. He pointed to his stab wound as proof. Investigators decided to take a closer look at the injury. The severity and the angle suggested it was self-inflicted.
How many days ago did you get it?
But why did he bother?
We believe that he thought the police might have had an idea or were looking at him as a suspect in the case, which we weren't, but that's why we believed he made this particular scenario up.
But Kodatich's plan backfired and led investigators right to him. Based on the evidence, police believe that Kodatich prowled for vulnerable women to abduct, molest, and kill. For the murders of Amy Hoffman and Deirdre O'Brien, James Kodatich was sentenced to 95 years. Kodatich was difficult to apprehend because his random victims had no connection to him. Most murders aren't random, and the killer goes to great lengths to obliterate the connection between himself and the victim. On May 8, 1993, a young couple at Lake Lou Yeager Park in Illinois frantically summoned the help of the park caretaker. Someone had built a fire in a pile of brush. In the center was what looked like a mannequin. At first, the couple thought it was a prank, but when they looked closer, they realized whoever did this was deadly serious. The body was real. After the body was pulled from the smoldering pile, the police were notified. Police could discern that the victim was female, but that was all. Her head was missing. They retrieved melted trash bags and a charred cardboard carton from the debris. Detective Mike Sheely of the Illinois State Police led the search for more clues.
We brought in Illinois State Police dogs and attempted to search the area for any other possible evidence and the possibility of finding the victim's decapitated head. Those were unsuccessful.
Investigators had no clue who the killer was and no clue to the victim either. They felt confident that the identity of the victim would lead to her killer. This crime was simply too gruesome to be a random attack.
Anyone who'd go to all that trouble to try to burn a body and to decapitate them went to a lot of trouble because of the association between the suspect and the victim.
For now, their best clue was the victim herself. X-rays revealed fibroid tumors in her uterus, severe enough to cause medical problems. The plastic bags were ordinary trash bags. The cardboard carton was from a self-service moving company. Neither seemed like much of a clue. A forensic anthropologist was called in to determine all he could from the victim's bones. Determining an approximate age, height, and the victim's race would be crucial to matching her with a missing persons report. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Mark Johnsey of the Illinois State Police Crime Lab made the analysis.
The pubic symphysis, which is down the pelvic region, is a very good indicator of age. The pelvic bone in this area changes very diagnostically with age, and based on that I could make an assessment of her age, which I gave her an age range of 35 to 39.
Establishing race was more problematic. Flesh tone is distorted in death, and the fire didn't help that. Dr. Johnsey had to rely on his best judgment under difficult circumstances.
Both the pubic hair and the axillary hair in the armpit, which she had both, was very straight. And she was fairly light-skinned, and with a combination of those features, it was just felt that she was a Caucasian.
Now, investigators needed a name. The most certain way of identifying a person is by fingerprints. But that works only if they can be lifted from the victim and if the victim's prints are on file somewhere. Illinois State Police forensic scientist Gary Havey was assigned the task of seeing that this Jane Doe met those requirements. The victim's hands were removed and sent in sealed cans to his lab. They were dry and stiffened in a clutched position. If Havey hoped to raise any prints, he'd have to amputate individual fingers and soften the tissue.
In the case of Jane Doe, in order to soften the tissue, one of the procedures or methods that I have found to be useful over the last years is to actually soak the fingers in a solution of detergent.
The solution softens the tissue on the friction ridges, which are the unique arches, whorls, and loops on every person's fingertips. Once the fingers were softened and dried, Havey rolled them in ink and printed their ridge patterns onto white paper. But he wasn't satisfied.
I didn't want just suitable prints, I wanted the absolute best standard we could achieve. We then decided to utilize a different method in obtaining the friction ridge detail from the fingers and palms. Over the years, I've had good success utilizing black powder and frosted lifting tape.
The powder and tape yielded better results, which were then photographed and labeled. They would then be classified and sent to AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System in Joliet, Illinois, which holds fingerprint cards for the entire state. Only Jane Doe's left thumb and index fingers were clear enough for the AFIS computer. Usually, that's all it needs.
At this time, there were 1.7 to 1.8 million cards on file in Joliet. It would be totally impossible for me to manually search all of those cards, but with AFIS, we can actually scan those individual cards in a period of 30 minutes upwards to 2 or 3 hours.
The results came back negative. No matches. The victim and her killer remained anonymous. A nameless murder victim was found burning in an Illinois park. Until investigators could determine the identity of the Caucasian woman, her killer would remain free. Desperate for clues, detectives interviewed witnesses who were in the park the night the body was discovered. 2 students, taking a drive after their prom, reported seeing the fire. Nearby was a cargo van. They believed the tags were from Missouri. The back was open, and they could see plastic trash bags. Detectives were convinced the teenagers next saw the killer.
They actually pull alongside the suspect van, and they're quite alarmed that somebody would actually have a fire in this no-burn area. They're familiar with the park, and basically at that point, the suspect sees the car pull alongside, and he immediately runs and jumps into the van and speeds away.
But without a tag number, it was another untraceable lead. To solve this case, investigators had to identify the victim, who they referred to as Janie Doe. They expanded the APHIS fingerprint search.
We performed APHIS searches in over 45 different APHIS systems throughout the United States, Canada, and even Puerto Rico. This would prove to be the most extensive APHIS search ever undertaken by the Illinois State Police.
Millions of prints were scrutinized, and still no leads. The victim apparently had no criminal record and was not on any database. Likewise, hundreds of missing persons reports were scrutinized over a period of more than 18 months. Though none matched the description of a 30-something Caucasian woman whose fingerprints matched Janie Doe's, one name consistently popped up.
The one constant factor that we continued to see was a victim, Lynn Matcham Thomas, from the greater St. Louis area. She had came on our list before, and we had called St. Louis missing persons and also talked to the homicide squad, but we had discounted the fact that this would be our victim because she was African American.
With no other leads, investigators went to speak with Shirley Matcham, the mother of Lynn Matcham Thomas. Like her daughter, she lived in Missouri, only 50 miles from the Illinois park where the victim was found. Shirley had reported Lynn missing the day before the body was found. According to her mother, Lynn had light skin. Like the victim, she also had fibroid tumors that she was seeing a doctor about. In fact, the day she disappeared, her brother had dropped her off at her doctor's office and made arrangements to pick her up afterward. When he returned, he was 10 minutes late. He went inside, but she was no longer there. He assumed that she grew tired of waiting and decided to walk home. He didn't think anything more about it. Later that night, Mrs. Matcham received a call from Lynn's husband, Curtis Thomas, asking where Lynn might be. He said she'd left his house 20 minutes earlier, and he assumed she'd gone to her mother's. But her mother hadn't seen her all day. Shirley Matcham knew her son-in-law to be violent and suspected the worst. The next day, she filed a missing persons report with the St. Louis Police Department. Investigators reviewed the report. They learned that St. Louis police had followed up with a visit to Lynn's home to speak with her husband, Curtis Thomas. He told them that the night Lynn disappeared, she was moving out of the house. He wasn't happy about it, and they fought. The last time he'd seen her, she was walking away from the house. At first, he thought she'd just run off without her things. But when she didn't show up at her mother's, he thought something serious might have happened. Sifting through the report, investigators found another potential clue.
We also found out that when Lynn Matcham Thomas was discovered missing, that the police had went to the Thomas residence and asked for permission to search the house. Mr. Thomas let him in. They conducted a search on the second and first floors, and when the police asked to go to the basement, Mr. Thomas insisted that he call his attorney, and they terminated the search.
With no victim or any signs of foul play, the missing persons investigation in St. Louis ended. But now, almost 2 years later, investigators in Illinois suspected that the body found in the park was Lynn Matcham Thomas. The timing of her disappearance fit. Her medical condition was the same. And her husband, Curtis Thomas, was becoming the prime suspect. Investigators in Illinois struggled to identify a decapitated woman found burning in a state park. Though they believed she was Shirley Matcham Thomas and that her husband Curtis had put her there, they had to prove it. Investigators went back to Lynn's mother for past employment information about her daughter.
And quite to our surprise, she said that her daughter had been employed by a local bank, and during the course of that employment that she had been fingerprinted. So we were able to go to the St. Louis Police Department now and look in a specific file. Those files were not in any database, and manually had to pull those fingerprints to compare them with our Janie Doe.
The comparison was made. Janie Doe was, in fact, Lynn Matcham Thomas. Because of their stormy marriage, their violent history, and the fact that he was the last one to have seen Lynn, Curtis Thomas became the prime suspect. What police needed was proof. Investigators now tried to find a link between evidence left at the crime scene and the suspect. They determined that a cardboard carton pulled from the fire was from the same moving company that the victim was using to pack her belongings. However incriminating, the evidence was only circumstantial. To learn more about Curtis Thomas and his activities following Lynn's disappearance, investigators located an ex-girlfriend who he started seeing after his wife was reported missing. She said that Curtis claimed the police were stupid for misidentifying the race of Janie Doe. This was several weeks before she was identified as African American. She also added that Curtis had access to a van through his work. It matched the description of the van seen at the park the night of the murder. The girlfriend was frightened of Curtis and ended the relationship. That testimony, along with the rest of the circumstantial evidence they gathered, gave investigators enough to arrest Curtis Thomas in January 1995 for suspicion of murdering his wife almost 2 years earlier. A search warrant for his home was issued. Though Thomas insisted he knew nothing about the fate of his estranged wife, investigators found newspaper clippings regarding the mysterious body in Illinois. Police theorized that the abusive Curtis Thomas was unwilling to let his wife simply walk out on him. Investigators believe that after murdering Lynn Matcham Thomas, He kept the body in the basement until he could get the work van. And to throw investigators off his trail, he beheaded the victim, then transported her to the park in Illinois, where he set the remains on fire. Curtis Thomas was found guilty. He was sentenced to life without parole. Thomas tried to erase the connection between himself and the victim. Others try to erase all evidence of the crime itself. On September 14, 1985, a motorist on a secluded highway in Utah pulled over to help a frantic man. David Mosman said his pickup truck went off the road in Logan Canyon and plunged 285 feet to the river below. His wife, Tanya, was still down there. The motorist called for help. Though banged up and visibly shaken, Mosman's injuries were relatively minor. He told emergency workers that his wife was conscious when he'd helped her out of the wreck and onto the shore. He begged them to help her. As David Mosman was transported to the hospital, a rescue team was in the canyon, searching in the dark for his wife. About 40 feet from the overturned vehicle, caught on rocks in the middle of the river, lay Tanya Mosman. She was face down in the water, dead. By the time she was retrieved, David Mosman was in the hospital getting his wounds treated. He told the nurse that he glanced off the road for a second to look at his wife. At that instant, the truck went over. He blamed his carelessness for the accident. Investigators arrived at the hospital. They asked the nurse if David was in any shape to make a statement. She told them that his injuries were minor and he needn't stay there. She said that Mosman told her he'd been thrown from the truck just as it went over the embankment. She considered him lucky to be alive. Investigators waited until the next day to get a detailed account of the accident. When asked about his marriage, David Mosman said that things between him and his wife had been shaky. They were going through a bitter divorce, but lately they were working to save their relationship. That night, he'd taken her to a restaurant. They enjoyed themselves and each other. It was like it used to be before their relationship soured. After dinner, they'd headed home. David Mosman had driven that stretch of road dozens of times before. He said he must have taken his eyes off the road as he approached the curb. He said all he remembered was his wife's screams. Confused and shaken, he made his way to the bottom of the canyon. When he reached Tanya, she was partially ejected from the back of the truck. He helped her out and started back up to get help. Utah Highway Patrol Officer Larry Forsgren worked the accident investigation.
He said he put her on the bank and that she was all right, and he had talked to her and she was fine. He said that she did mention that her head hurt a little bit, but other than that, and he didn't see any blood, she wasn't bleeding, and he put her on the bank so then he'd go up and get help.
Mosman said it took him more than 2 hours to climb up the canyon in the dark. He thought he must have blacked out or fallen asleep in the cold. He didn't know how his wife ended up back in the river. In the days following Tanya Mosman's death, accident reconstruction experts studied the spot where the truck went over. On the pavement was a small scuff mark, showing that the steering wheel was turned abruptly off the road at about 20 to 30 miles per hour. For Cache County Deputy Medical Examiner Sergeant George Becker, that fact presented an inconsistency with David Mosman's account.
At that point, the vehicle would tilt up to go off the road as it's going over the bank. It would have been impossible to get out of the vehicle on the driver's side. You'd have to lift the door straight up and climb out while the vehicle is moving. It's impossible.
The routine analysis of the accident had raised more questions than it answered. For investigators, this case demanded a closer look. Police in Utah continued investigating the tragic death of Tanya Mosman, killed when the truck she and her husband David were driving plunged 285 feet into a canyon. David Mosman's account of the accident didn't jibe with the facts. Investigators requested an autopsy on Tanya Mosman. Water in her lungs showed that her cause of death was drowning. A mark from hip to shoulder suggested she'd been wearing her seatbelt, which would have made it impossible for her to be thrown through the back windshield, as her husband claimed. The only other marks to her body were 3 blunt and distinctive contusions on the back of her head. Looking for answers, the forensics team inspected the truck for what might have caused the marks. They also used chemically treated swabs called hemosticks, which turn blue on contact with traces of blood. No blood was found, and no object in the truck could have caused the victim's contusions. Investigators went back to the scene to gather more information. What they found was a length of sprinkler irrigation pipe entangled on the riverbank. David Mosman, a school teacher, moonlighted as a sprinkler installer. The pipe was sent to Dr. Kent Glanville of the Logan County Police Department Crime Lab for further examination. He placed the pipe over life-sized photographs of the wounds on Tanya's head. The pipe was a perfect fit. But Mosman had a reason to carry it, and, however unlikely, it might have struck the victim during the truck's tumble. With all the inconsistencies and lingering questions, investigators pressed Mosman to try to remember more details of the accident. He was asked to draw a map of the road and to mark where he lost control and went over. He did it with pinpoint accuracy, something most accident victims can't do.
He was exactly sure that this is where he went off, and it was close to the approximate same area that the vehicle went off. And that was kind of odd because when he went off, it was nighttime, it was dark. And for him to pinpoint it, he had to be pretty familiar with that location. And I got the impression that he knew beforehand where that vehicle was going to go off.
Things that I just don't think anything about.
2 days after the accident, that impression was reinforced when a friend of David Mosman's named Terry contacted police. He said the couple had a difficult marriage and that David was always joking about how he was going to kill Tanya. Chief Prosecutor Jim Jenkins followed the investigation.
David told Terry that he didn't want to go through the expense of a divorce. He didn't want to risk losing custody of the two children. And he didn't want to give any of the property or finances that he had accumulated.
Now trying to prove that David Mosman had murdered his wife, police began interviewing Tanya's friends. They were well aware of the Mosmans' disintegrating marriage. One friend said that Tanya was often terrified of David. Sometimes he was violent. Mostly they fought over the custody of their two young children. She told investigators that David had recently tried to make Tanya sign a document he'd written, forcing her to relinquish custody of their kids if they divorced. He'd even threatened to kill her if she didn't sign it. Even so, Tanya sought legal advice about getting a divorce. Shortly after that, David began acting very nicely to her. Tanya told her friend that she was looking forward to dinner with her husband. She sincerely believed that on the night she died, they would reconcile. It all seemed tragically convenient for David Mosman, so investigators continued to dig. They discovered that David had had a $10,000 life insurance policy on his wife for many years. But 9 months before her death, while their marriage was crumbling, he took out additional policies for an additional $100,000. A motive was firmly established, and the circumstances of Tanya's death were suspicious. Still, it could have been an improbable accident. Investigators had to prove that it wasn't. David Mosman said he left his injured wife on the riverbank, but she was found in the middle of the river. Investigators hired hydrological engineer Dr. Dave Tullis to see if that was possible.
The deputy wanted me to assess the situation and see if there was any reasonable way that she could have gone from the riverbank, where he said he left her, to the location in the river in the condition that she was in.
Dr. Tullis measured the river's depth, velocity, and direction of the current to calculate if an object as large as a human body could be carried from the bank and deposited at the spot where the victim was found. He determined that the shallow water near the bank couldn't support a body, and even if it could, the speed and direction of the current would carry it along the edge, not to the middle of the river.
If she was unconscious, she couldn't move, and the current would not have been able to move her along, and so she would have been found right by the riverbank in the unconscious condition or drowned condition.
But she wasn't. She had never been taken to the bank of the river, as her husband had said. David Mosman was arrested for suspicion of murdering his wife. Investigators believe that David Mosman tried to kill Tanya in the premeditated crash. But when she survived, he had to climb down the canyon and finish the job. The motive, apparently, was hatred of his wife, custody of his children, and $110,000 in insurance. For his crimes, David Mosman was sentenced to life in prison. Prisons are filled with people who thought they'd committed the perfect crime. But a murder isn't over once the victim is dead. for investigators, that's just the beginning. They turned to forensic scientists to help bring justice to the victims by exposing a killer's fatal error. An elderly woman is pulled from the murky waters of a rural pond in Alabama. A few scraps of evidence are all investigators have to link her to her killer.
We found her.
In Texas, the body of a woman swept away in a flash flood is found downstream. Can forensic scientists wash away deception and find proof of murder? A car crash on a country road in Wisconsin claims a woman's life. Detectives must wade through ambiguous evidence to prove her death was no accident. Once, water could dissolve evidence linking murderers to their crimes. But today, scientists can look beneath the surface for proof of homicide, even when the victims are found dead in the water. Grand Bay, Alabama, May 21st, 1994. Two teenagers boating on a pond, known locally as Blue Hole, noticed something floating in the water. As they approached, they realized it was a human body. They fled the scene and alerted their parents, who called the police. When the Mobile County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene, they recovered the body of an elderly woman. It was clear that this was not an accidental drowning. The victim had a tire jack chained around her waist, and her hands had been removed. As investigators began documenting the scene, detectives contacted the Sheriff's Department for a missing persons check. They hoped a search of NCIC, a database containing descriptions of people reported missing, could help them identify the victim. Sergeant Harold Bolster explains.
All missing person reports or missing persons are placed on the NCIC. And we look for any local matches, anything close to Mobile or Moss Point, Pascagoula, anything in the general region that might match up to what we had.
Only one name fit the description of the victim. 85-year-old Irma Williams had been reported missing the day before in nearby Moss Point, Mississippi. Dispatchers contacted Detective John J. Gaffney, who was investigating that disappearance.
And they advised that the Mobile County Sheriff's Office had discovered a body in Grand Bay, Alabama, which is the next jurisdiction over from us, and that they believed the body was could possibly be my missing person.
Detectives from the Moss Point, Mississippi Police Department were dispatched to the scene. After getting a detailed description of the victim from deputies, the detectives believed they had found Irma Williams. It appeared that their missing persons case was now a homicide. Investigators began searching the surrounding area for any evidence that would help them identify the killer. But a large amount of trash and debris had collected at the pond. Determining what was evidence and what wasn't would be difficult. As investigators scoured the area near the water's edge, they found fresh tire tracks imprinted in the sand.
Zigzag pattern.
Unsure if these tracks had been left by the killer, plaster casts were made. As the search of the area continued, detectives noticed a cigarette butt with a flattened end hidden among some overgrowth. Unlike most of the trash in the area, it didn't appear to have been there very long. It was collected and sent to the lab for further analysis. Though investigators believed that the victim was Irma Williams, they needed a positive identification.
Make sure.
They contacted her relatives. James and Sharon Williams confirmed that the victim was James's grandmother, Irma Williams.
Okay, I know this is hard, but I'm gonna have to ask you a couple questions.
James told the officer he and his wife were very close to Irma.
As hard as I know she is.
He described her as a vivacious woman who loved life and her family. Though her husband of more than 50 years had recently passed away, his estate had allowed her to remain independent. But James said that his father, Henderson Williams, was not close with Irma. In fact, Sharon added that Henderson hadn't seemed very worried when she told him no one could locate his mother. Sharon said she'd gone to Henderson's house around 11 p.m. the night before and found him burning trash in the yard. When told his mother was missing, Henderson seemed distracted and unconcerned. He was preoccupied by the fire the entire time.
You say she goes for walks?
Despite Henderson's lack of concern, Sharon and James could not imagine that he was involved in his own mother's murder. The autopsy on Irma Williams was performed by Dr. J.C. Upshaw Downs, the chief medical examiner for the state of Alabama. The official cause of death was listed as severe blunt force trauma to the head. Irma Williams had died well before being placed in the pond. And for Dr. Downs, the manner in which the victim's hands were removed was also telling.
This was a clean cut, obviously a sharp instrument like a knife or a razor had been used. There was no hemorrhage or bleeding into the soft tissues. That told me that these were post-mortem injuries. And from that information, it became apparent that somebody was trying to obscure her identity.
By going to such great lengths to hide the victim's identity, investigators were confident the killer was someone close to her. They went to Irma's residence to search for answers. On a section of vinyl flooring in Irma's kitchen, investigators found reddish-brown stains that appeared to be blood. A plastic bag recovered from underneath the sink also looked blood-stained. Convinced they had found the murder scene, investigators continued searching for evidence of homicide. On the table, they noticed an ashtray full of cigarette butts. The ends of the filters were flattened, just like the one recovered from the crime scene.
Small bag?
I had observed an ashtray that had a lot of cigarette butts in it with a real distinctive bite mark on them. I questioned the family about these cigarette butts, and they advised that it was their father's cigarette butts, that he had a real distinctive way he bit on the filter.
Now, detectives wanted to speak to Irma's son, Henderson Williams. When they arrived at his home, he wasn't there. As they prepared to leave, investigators noticed a woman leaving the trailer on Henderson's property.
Excuse me, ma'am. Can I talk to you for a second?
She identified herself as Brenda Rowell. She rented the trailer from Henderson Williams.
A couple
Though she stated that she and Henderson were close, she was unaware that Irma had been murdered. Investigators sensed that the news made Brenda uneasy. They asked her to accompany them to the Mobile County Sheriff's Department to answer more questions.
She'll be back in no time. Okay? You know, with short notice and everything, and
Detectives asked Brenda if she'd seen anything unusual at Henderson's place recently.
Can I ask you a couple questions, okay?
Yeah, he was arguing a lot.
She mentioned seeing Henderson washing his car the day before.
There's a lot of fighting going on.
He'd scrubbed it inside and out, even the trunk. Brenda thought it was odd that Henderson would suddenly take such pride in the old car's appearance.
Okay, Brenda, let me ask you,
Investigators showed her a picture of the tire jack recovered from Irma's body.
Yes.
Brenda was surprised. It looked like hers.
You gave him that jack?
She said she had lent it to Henderson recently, but he had not returned it. Investigators turned their focus toward Henderson's relationship with his mother.
She's a very sweet lady, arguing a lot.
Brenda said that Henderson and Irma had been arguing over money from his father's estate.
No, just needed it.
Irma felt her son was greedy and lazy and decided to cut him out of her will and denied him access to money left to her by his father. Henderson became irate.
Can we about this place?
In fact, Brenda admitted that a few weeks back, she and Henderson had a bitter argument.
I need you to sign it on the check. Sign?
No, I don't like doing this. I don't want to be.
Henderson wanted her to sign Irma's name on checks he had taken from his mother.
Sit down. I need you to fill a check.
Brenda was reluctant to do it, but Henderson threatened to evict her from the trailer if she didn't. She felt she had no choice. She forged Irma's name on the checks.
Don't worry about it.
For detectives, a motive for murder was beginning to take shape.
Okay, I'll be right there.
And Henderson Williams was now the prime suspect in the death of his mother. Now, investigators needed to prove it. To corroborate Brenda Rowell's story, detectives contacted the manager of Irma's bank. Not only did she confirm Brenda's account, she said that just before Irma's death, Irma had filed forgery charges against her son. Though the information didn't prove murder, it was enough for investigators to obtain a search warrant for Henderson's property.
I appreciate it.
Police waited until Henderson was away from his residence before executing the warrant. An inspection of Henderson's vehicle revealed the presence of small reddish stains on a rear taillight and larger stains on the trunk's carpet. All of the samples were collected and sent to the state crime lab for further analysis. Investigators also took inked impressions of the car's tires to compare to those recovered at the pond. As the search of Henderson's property continued, investigators located the burn pile described earlier by Sharon Williams. Sifting through the rubble, they found several small bone fragments. Mindful that the victim's hands had been removed and never found, investigators collected the remains. All of the evidence was pointing to Henderson Williams as the killer. But until investigators could physically link him to the murder, he would remain a free man. Police in Alabama and Mississippi struggled to solve the murder of 85-year-old Irma Williams, found floating in a local fishing pond. Though the circumstantial evidence pointed to her son, Henderson Williams, as the killer, investigators had no physical evidence tying him to the murder. Items collected from a search of Henderson's property were sent to the Alabama Department of Forensic Science. Medical examiner Dr. J.C. Upshaw Downs started with bone fragments found in the burn pile.
We were concerned at the time, since her hands had been removed, that those potentially could have been bones from Ms. Williams' hands. So they were examined by our anthropologist and also examined for DNA in order to determine if they were human, and if they were human, were they Ms. Williams. It turned out that they were non-human remains.
Still, examiners had other items recovered from Henderson's property. Serologist Elaine Scott analyzed stains taken from the trunk liner of Henderson's vehicle to determine if they were of human origin. Tetramethylbenzidine, a chemical that reacts to protein in human blood by turning it blue, is applied to the swabs. The initial screening confirmed the stains found in Henderson's trunk were human blood. Scott then repeated the process on the stains found on items from the victim's kitchen. They too were of human origin. Now, examiners needed to determine the source of the blood. DNA testing was performed on all of the samples. After extracting and isolating specific genetic characteristics in each sample, examiners determined the blood found in the victim's kitchen was genetically consistent with the blood found in Henderson's car. When those results were compared to DNA samples taken from Irma Williams at autopsy, the results were indisputable.
The blood stains in this case were at the house and placed the victim bleeding in the house, and also they placed the victim bleeding on the car.
Though the evidence was powerful, it was not ironclad. To make their case, investigators needed to physically link Henderson Williams to the crime scene. And there was one piece of evidence that had to be tested. The cigarette butt found at the pond. With only microscopic traces of saliva to work with, examiners determined there was sufficient DNA in the cigarette butt to perform the analysis. Elaine Scott then compared those results to DNA taken from other cigarette butts known to be Henderson's.
The saliva did give us a DNA profile that matched to Mr. Williams, indicating that he had smoked the cigarette at the crime scene.
The information was enough to arrest Henderson Williams for the murder of his 85-year-old mother.
Step out here, please. Listen to this, officer.
In custody, Henderson maintained his innocence, claiming he hadn't been near the pond in recent days. But all of the forensic evidence suggested otherwise.
Okay.
Investigators had matched the tire tread impression recovered at the scene to a tire on Henderson's car.
Listen to these officers, please. Don't tell you what to do.
Police believe that Henderson Williams' anger raged out of control when his mother cut him off from his father's estate. Investigators believe that Henderson Williams went to his mother's home, where he beat her to death. He then removed her hands, hoping to prevent identification, then placed her body in the pond. In April 1996, Henderson Williams stood trial for the murder of his mother, Irma Williams.
This was right there in front of your house. This was in your car.
He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
Mr. Williams?
In Alabama, there was no doubt that a woman pulled from a small pond had been murdered. But in Texas, police would have to wade through the evidence to determine whether a woman's death was an accident or murder. In this story, some of the names have been changed. Fort Worth, Texas, May 3rd, 1987. Francis and Jesus de la Rosa were settling in for the evening when they heard screams outside their suburban home.
Somebody out there.
A man, soaking wet and distraught, stumbled inside.
My girlfriend. Your girlfriend?
He pleaded for them to call 911.
Ayúdenme, por favor. Call the police.
He said his car had been swept away in a flash flood and his girlfriend was missing. The Fort Worth Fire Department's swift water rescue team received the call. For them, these emergencies were becoming all too familiar. Torrential rains had pounded the Fort Worth area during the previous month, destroying property and worse. According to Fire Captain Richard Ward, many people had lost their lives while attempting to drive through flash floods.
The people are on their way to wherever, and they decide to try to cross the water or cross the road where the water's going, and they get swept downstream because just looking at it, they can't tell how deep the water is, and they always underestimate how powerful the water is.
This night, 2 people had made that mistake, and now one of them was missing. The rescue team searched the area near the bridge crossing where the car had been swept away. Divers scoured below the creek surface for any signs of the missing woman or the vehicle. But after several hours of exhaustive searching, rescuers found nothing. As the search continued, police questioned the driver, 40-year-old Domingo Turo, a Cuban immigrant who spoke broken English. Turo told police he had tried to drive through the water on the road. Detective Mike Garvin reviewed Turo's statement.
He didn't realize how swift the water was. He tried to back up, and it was too late. It started washing him off into the creek, and that he tried to get out and was in fact able to, he and the victim both, to get out of the car.
Turo told police that he grabbed his girlfriend, 20-year-old Janice Walters, as the car filled with water and went tumbling downstream in the currents. But the raging water broke his grasp and she was lost. As the floodwaters began to recede several hours later, searchers were finally able to locate Turo's car. It was carried more than a mile from the crossing before being washed up on an embankment. Police retrieved the vehicle, but there was no sign of Janice Walters.
We performed a search around the vehicle, thinking that she might have stayed close to the vehicle whenever it was swept off the roadway. Our search around the vehicle and in the vehicle didn't turn up anything.
Rescuers continued looking for her, but with each passing hour, hopes of finding her unharmed grew dimmer. The search continued into the following day. Around noon, searchers discovered a body washed up on the shoreline. The woman matched Janice's description. The lifeless body, nude except for a small chain necklace, was found 1.5 miles from the spot where the vehicle had been swept away. It seemed that the violent Texas storms had claimed another life. Rescue workers in Fort Worth, Texas, believed that they had recovered the body of 20-year-old Janice Walters, killed when the car she and her boyfriend, Domingo Turo, were driving, got swept away in a flash flood. Authorities contacted Turo and Janice's sister, Kelly Hill, and asked them to identify the body. Kelly confirmed that her sister had been found. Investigators noticed that she seemed distant and cold toward Domingo Turo. In a statement taken later that day, Kelly confirmed that no one in her family was happy about Janice's relationship with Turo. Janice's body was transported to the Tarrant County morgue, to undergo an autopsy. Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Nizam Pirwani was immediately struck by the condition of the body.
One of the strange things that we discovered at the autopsy was that the body was totally nude, and the story given to us was that she was wearing a blouse and a pair of blue jeans. In 20 years' time, I've never seen a case where the body has been totally disrobed.
And a necklace still clasped around the victim's neck had inexplicably remained intact, though there were numerous other injuries in the same area. Dr. Pirwani also noted the lack of telltale signs usually associated with drowning victims.
In most cases of drowning, one sees purging of frothy fluid, which is usually blood-tinged, and this comes out from the nostrils and the mouth. And it's also present in the trachea and the bronchioles. And this frothy fluid is due to admixing of air and water which is being inhaled in a person who is drowning. We didn't see such frothy fluid anywhere.
That meant there was no water in the victim's lungs. Janice Walters had not died of drowning. As Dr. Pirwani struggled to make sense of his findings, he examined injuries found on the victim's neck. He noticed what appeared to be curvilinear abrasions, injuries typically caused by a victim's fingernails in a struggle to break a stranglehold. None of Janice's injuries were consistent with a drowning death. Dr. Pirwani stopped the examination and contacted Fort Worth police. He wanted to be certain that he had not misunderstood the circumstances surrounding Janice's death. But investigators had no reason to believe that her death was anything but a tragic accident. And the tragedy didn't end with Janice's death alone. As Dr. Pirwani proceeded with the internal examination, he discovered that she was in the early stages of pregnancy. The examination held one last surprise. There were deep hemorrhages of the muscles in the victim's neck. For Dr. Pirwani, there was only one way to explain all of the injuries.
We were not able to show any water in the lung, no frothy fluid, no blood-tinged fluid in the trachea or the bronchial tree. So the negative findings of lungs as well as the positive findings of the neck were consistent with the manual strangulation.
Dr. Pirwani's routine post-mortem examination had uncovered a homicide. After reviewing the autopsy results, Detective Mike Garvin wanted to speak with Janice's boyfriend, Domingo Turo. To overcome any confusion caused by the language barrier, he enlisted a translator for the interview. Turo claimed that recently his relationship with Janice had been rocky. But on the night she died, they had reconciled and were looking forward to starting over. He said he and Janice were returning from dinner shortly after 9 p.m. He started crossing the low-water bridge when a flash flood swept the car into the creek. He struggled to keep the car from being swept downstream. But as the car began to fill with water, he panicked and stated he may have grabbed Janice by the neck to keep her from drowning. But ultimately, the powerful currents tore them apart and she was lost. If Turo had grabbed Janice by the neck, it seemed unlikely that the thin gold chain necklace would have remained intact. Dr. Pirwani's findings, coupled with Turo's statements, led investigators to suspect that he had murdered Janice Walters. But so far, they had no real physical evidence to prove it.
Get the landmarks in.
Question I have to ask you.
Investigators in Fort Worth, Texas, believe that the death of 20-year-old Janice Walters was a deliberate act of murder.
Yes, ma'am, you will.
And her boyfriend, Domingo Turo, was the prime suspect. But police had little physical evidence and no motive to make their case. Detective Mike Garvin reviewed statements made by Janice's sister, Kelly Hill. Kelly described Janice as a warm young woman, full of fun, who'd always been very close to her family. She was excited at the prospect of being a mother. But Turo, the father of the unborn child, had become abusive and didn't want the responsibilities that came with having a baby.
It's nice to know that you're living.
For the sake of her unborn child, Janice had no choice but to end the relationship with Turo. She moved home to be with her family. But Kelly stated that Turo refused to let her out of his life. A few days before Janice died, Turo called the house and they argued bitterly.
I know you are still thinking.
Kelly stated she listened to the conversation on another extension. Turo threatened to kill Janice if she left him.
You will be sorry if you leave. I am telling you.
Convinced that Turo had followed through on his threat, investigators still needed proof. They pored over Turo's statement, looking for any clue they may have overlooked. They found one. Turo said that he and Janice were returning from dinner when they were caught in the flash flood. Looking over maps of the area, detectives realized the couple had been heading in the wrong direction on a dead-end street. Paul Dixon, Assistant District Attorney for Tarrant County, explains the importance of the discovery.
The neighborhood used that dead-end area as sort of an illegal dumping ground. Old mattresses, old tires, trash, that sort of thing. The police had informed us that from time to time, a body would be recovered from that place.
For investigators, it was now clear that Turo was on his way to the dump to dispose of Janice's body. With his story discredited, detectives now had enough evidence to arrest Domingo Turo for the capital murder of Janice Walters.
¿Qué haces, eh?
Police believe that when Janice returned to Turo's home to pick up her belongings, his possessiveness, inflamed by Janice's rejection of him, exploded into violence.
No te vas para ninguna parte. You will stay here. No, you will.
After killing her, he removed her clothes and then tried to hide her body, along with any trace of the crime.
He was traveling across the low water bridge, through the rainstorm, through the flood, and nature intervened and kept him from getting to his goal.
Domingo Turo was tried and convicted for the murder of Janice Walters. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison.
Forensic science was very important because without Dr. Pirwani being able to do the autopsy and prove that it was a strangulation, we wouldn't have had a case, even though no matter how much the family thought probably that he had done something foul, we would have had no proof of it at all.
In Texas, forensic science exposed a murderer who tried to submerge evidence of his crime in a flash flood. But in Wisconsin, it took an attentive forensic pathologist to recognize a homicide disguised as an accident. Berlin, Wisconsin, August 22, 1990. A blasting company employee was locking up for the day when he heard someone screaming for help. A man, covered in mud, said he'd just been in a car accident and his ex-wife was unconscious.
Okay, all right.
After calling 911, the two rushed back to the scene. Within minutes, the Green Lake County Sheriff's Department and Berlin Emergency Medical Units arrived. They found a white car in a water-filled ditch, resting against a muddy embankment.
Come on, get one of you guys in here. Let's go.
A woman, face down in the ditch, was pulled from the water.
Okay.
Emergency technicians who rushed to her aid discovered that she wasn't breathing. They immediately began critical life-saving procedures, including CPR, to resuscitate her. The efforts paid off. The victim began breathing on her own. Barely clinging to life, she was rushed to the hospital. As the ambulance pulled away, police took a brief statement from the other accident victim. He identified himself as Daniel Egan and the woman as his ex-wife, Darlene. He said she'd swerved suddenly to avoid a deer, and the car plunged into the ditch. Egan told deputies he'd gone for help and returned to find Darlene face down in the water. Darlene was taken to the emergency room at Berlin Memorial Hospital, where doctors fought to save her life. A Green Lake County deputy met Darlene's family at the hospital. As he was explaining details of the accident, a doctor came and told them Darlene had not survived her injuries. The family was devastated by the news, and they couldn't understand why Darlene was with her ex-husband. Sheriff's Deputy Ron Click explains.
When I informed them that Dan Egan was a passenger in the vehicle when it had gone off the roadway, the family indicated to me that because of the rather stormy relationship that they had, that it wasn't likely that she would allow Dan Egan to be in her vehicle.
The deputy contacted investigators at the scene and passed along the information. Wisconsin state troopers began their routine accident reconstruction. By measuring the angle and dimensions of the tire marks left on the road, investigators estimated that the car had been traveling at approximately 49 miles per hour, slightly under the speed limit.
Okay.
But the marks left on the pavement were not the result of braking.
Over there?
They were the result of a deliberate, high-speed turn. According to State Trooper Dennis McConnell, that fact was unusual.
An operator in a vehicle faced with a hazard such as a deer, almost 99% of the time, the first driver reaction to that hazard is to step on the brakes. And there was no indication of braking whatsoever.
The findings were enough for investigators to request that a thorough forensic examination be performed on the vehicle. The car was towed to the police impound lot. The hospital pathologist performed an autopsy on Darlene Egan. From the amount of water in her lungs, the official cause of death was ruled a drowning. But something about the victim's condition was troubling. There was an excessive amount of mud found under her eyes and in her nose and ears. The coroner requested that Darlene Egan's body be re-examined by a forensic pathologist. That evening, evidence technicians began processing the vehicle for clues. They noted the condition of the seatbelt. It was stretched over the steering wheel, still in the buckled position. Technicians also observed a lot of mud plastered on the front of the car. That wasn't unusual, but a closer inspection of the bumper revealed a hair embedded in the mud. Not knowing its significance, the hair was collected and sent to the lab for further analysis. Examiners would later determine that the hair did not belong to Darlene Egan. Investigators interviewed Dan Egan the following day.
Yeah, sure.
They wanted a moment-by-moment account of the accident. Dan said he and Darlene were going to his mother's house to pick up their 2 children when the accident occurred. Egan told police his ex-wife suddenly yelled, "Deer," and swerved hard to the right off the road. The next thing he remembered was the car in the water-filled ditch. Darlene was unresponsive and slumped against the driver's door. Egan said he climbed out of the car and ran to the blasting company for help. He returned to the scene within a few minutes. He couldn't explain how Darlene ended up face down in the ditch. Maybe she'd come to, struggled out of the car, then lost consciousness again. For Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigations agent Rick Lewell, the amount of time necessary for that scenario was at odds with the facts.
We soon realized that there wasn't enough time involved for him to get out of the car, to run and get help, for her to get out of the car, for her to fall in the water and drown before he returned to the scene. So it wasn't passing the smell test. Something stunk here, something was wrong. We had to take a lot deeper look at this entire accident.
For investigators, the circumstances surrounding Darlene Egan's tragic death were raising too many questions. They hoped the forensic pathologist could give them answers. Police in Wisconsin investigating the drowning death of Darlene Egan, killed after the car she and her ex-husband Dan were driving crashed into a ditch, suspected foul play. And Dan Egan's statements to police weren't adding up. To find answers, detectives enlisted a forensic pathologist to conduct a second autopsy. Dr. Robert Huntington III, a forensic pathologist for the state of Wisconsin, was given the assignment.
When we do a forensic autopsy, we've got 3 ends in view. We want to see if we can determine a cause of death. We want to see if we can rule out other causes of death, and we want to see if that body itself can tell us anything about how that death arrived to that body.
The pathologist agreed with the original cause of death listed as drowning. But the injuries noted during the examination appeared inconsistent with injuries caused by a car crash. They looked like something else.
When we get bodies out of a motor vehicle crash, they are definitely banged up. And she wasn't that banged up. And the really disturbing feature were scratches on and around the face. Now, yes, you can get scratches in a car crash, but some of these had a semblance to fingernail, enough to worry you.
The presence of fingernail scratches found on the victim's head suggested the car crash hadn't caused the drowning. In the final analysis, Dr. Huntington believed that Darlene Egan had been murdered.
Now suppose somebody was holding her head under the water. Now that might explain fingernail marks and such like that.
Dr. Huntington's analysis gave investigators insight into how Darlene Egan died. But to make a murder case against her ex-husband, they now needed to find a motive. They turned to the victim's family for answers. Her sister, Denise Krause, told police that Darlene divorced Dan Egan in 1988 after 5 years of marriage. Dan had become physically abusive and Darlene lived in constant fear of him. But she was putting her life back together. Darlene had recently taken a job as a state police dispatcher and was a devoted mother to her 2 daughters. She had also become engaged to a police officer. Denise added that Darlene and Dan had been involved in a vicious custody battle up until the day before Darlene's death. As the elements of a motive began falling into place, police contacted Darlene's attorney in the custody dispute.
Yes, I need to talk to you.
She told investigators that Darlene had been granted primary custody of the children.
Southwest Correctional Center. Yes. With Jeff here?
And she confirmed that the ruling came down the day before the accident.
I want to take this opportunity to let you know my recommendation.
In fact, she had met with the couple to discuss the arrangements.
It is my recommendation that Mrs. Egan have full custody of
When told of the court's ruling, Dan became irate. He also resented having to pay child support. He vowed to keep his children no matter what. Armed with this information, investigators went back to question Dan Egan. But this time as the prime suspect in his ex-wife's murder.
Mr. Egan, we need to get some...
Knowing Darlene took great pains to avoid being alone with Dan Egan, investigators wanted to know how the two ended up in Darlene's car together. Dan stated that on the day of the accident, Darlene came by his home to pick up the kids. But Dan's mother had taken the kids that day and was unable to bring them back to his house. And Dan didn't have a car to go get them himself. He admitted that Darlene was upset when she arrived and learned she'd have to pick the children up at his mother's. Darlene and Dan's mother didn't get along, so according to Dan, she asked him to go with her. He claimed that's where they were going when the accident occurred. Before they left, Egan agreed to provide investigators with a hair sample. The hair was sent to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab for analysis. Dan Egan's hair was compared to the hair found on the bumper of Darlene's car. They matched. For investigators, there seemed to be only one explanation for how his hair ended up on the bumper. And that explanation was consistent with the excessive amount of mud noted on the victim's face during autopsy.
Darlene may have pulled hair from her ex-husband while she's fighting to keep from being pushed under the water. And if she did have a handful of his head hair and she's pushed under the car, she would then grab the undercarriage of the car and try and free herself to get out from underneath the water. And in doing so, she would have transferred his head hair to the undercarriage of that car.
As Darlene struggled to save her own life, she left behind proof of murder. Investigators finally had enough evidence to arrest Dan Egan for the murder of his ex-wife. Based on the evidence, police believe that as the couple drove down the road, Dan wrenched the wheel to the right, sending the car into the ditch. Darlene, still buckled into the driver's seat, was ripped from the car. In the struggle, Darlene grabbed Dan by the hair, but he finally overpowered her, forcibly holding her head underwater until she drowned. For the first-degree murder of his ex-wife, Dan Egan was sentenced to life in prison. Once, killers could escape detection by washing away evidence of their crime. But today, advances in forensic science can bring proof of murder to the surface, even when the victims are dead in the water.